A reading from the book of the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 33, verses 14 to 18. The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. In those days and at that time I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days Judah will be saved and Jerusalem will live in safety. And this is the name by which it will be called: the Lord is our righteousness. For thus says the Lord, David shall never lack a man to sit on the throne of the house of Israel, and the Levitical priest shall never lack a man in my presence to offer burnt offerings, to make grain offerings, and to make sacrifices for all time. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. And the second reading is from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 31, verses 31 to 34. The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, a covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, says the Lord. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws within them, and I will write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. No longer shall they teach one another, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, says the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and remember their sin no more. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. This week's passage centers around a few short verses in the book of Jeremiah regarding God's ongoing presence and the establishment of a new covenant in the hearts of the Israelite people. As you know, Jeremiah is the spokesperson for God at a time when Jerusalem had been sacked by the Babylonians and was in tatters. The people were taken prisoner to Babylon because of their unwillingness to follow God's commandments and their resistance to keeping the covenant with God. During their exile, the words Jeremiah speaks are to be of comfort and provide hope that they will be home again and back in right relationship with God. God will etch on their heart a new covenant, not one of stone like previously in the Egypt to Israel journey, but on their heart. This covenant will be innate. It will be as natural as breathing. No teaching will be required. The law of God will be put within them. They will know not just about God, they will know God. From the least to the greatest, all people will know God. Their iniquity forgiven and their sin forgotten. God's love and mercy will usher in a new era. God's everlasting love will prevail, and they will return home to enjoy its familiarity and bounty. These words of the prophet are meant to provide hope and paint a picture of a future which will come to fruition, even if there is no end date in sight at the moment. There would be times when, as the psalmist notes, the people sat by the rivers of Babylon and wept for their loss. Loss of land, loss of home, loss of temple, separation from friends and families hit them hard. And it's not difficult to understand their deep sense of grief, anxiety, and depression because of this exile from everything they had known. Jeremiah is speaking God's promise of return into this emotional abyss. He does so to remind them of the one thing that they still had, their identity as God's people. Despite their inability and unwillingness to make better choices in connection with their deepest spiritual values, God still offered them a chance to be redeemed and to find their way back home. Exile is not a fun place to be. The definition for exile in the dictionary is one who is forced to live away from one's natural home. And as we have experienced ourselves with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has affected the global community in profound and countless ways, we have had to learn to cope and adapt with the situation. Many people have found their symbolic river of Babylon and wept about the situation. They are in grief and anxiety, and it has not been an easy journey. Some people have found it hard to adapt to the restrictions caused by COVID-19. They have not wanted to curtail their lives in any way. They want to act like the situation is normal and that their rights trump the rights of everyone else. The problem they have faced is that exile also brings with it a choice. Once you are in exile, you either adapt to it the best you can, or you continue denying the reality of your situation, perhaps making it worse and longer than necessary. In our part of the world, vaccinations have made a difference in allowing us more freedom than we have had over the past 16 or 17 months. Nevertheless, accepting reality is not an easy thing to do, but it is totally necessary in order for us to move forward. For the Israelites, moving on involves hearing the words of the prophet. The prophet nudges people into seeing the bigger picture, or as Paul says, to walk by faith, not by sight. The prophet also calls them to remember their identity, who they have been, how God has acted in the past, in rescuing them and delivering from the Egyptians, who they are and who they will be in the future. For us, in the pandemic, it is hard to speak in broad strokes because there are many ways people understand and cope with this pandemic. For us, who identify specifically as Christians, we are also invited to see the big picture. That is, our number one priority is to remember who we are and whose we are. Keeping one's identity during a time which threatens their sense of self and everything they hold important is not an easy task. Losing sight of this will bring anxiety, stress, and despair. It causes us to question the very purpose of life. The very things our lives were built on collapse or become irrelevant. Many people have suffered physically and emotionally because their center has been shattered, and they have had nothing to lean on when times got very tough. I am not saying that as Christians we have the market cornered on staying focused and upbeat during these times. Other people of faith and non-faith alike have done it as well. But they know who they are and what is important in their life. Wishing things were different and that we could get back to normal is something that they know will not happen. There is a new normal now, and it will continue into the future. It may even morph into something else. Who knows? In the meantime, the words of Jeremiah should give us hope, and yes, even joy. It is a continuous theme in the Bible from beginning to end. God's presence is ongoing. Even when God's people stray from the center of their spiritual life, God will still be there when they return because God never leaves. I had a professor in seminary who spoke a great deal about the silence of God, particularly in the Hebrew Scriptures. God's silence came when God's people drifted away and forgot their main spiritual practices and purpose that provided them guidance and sustenance. God was not speaking to them because there was no more to say to a people who just would not listen. God could not force them to hear and see that they were on a road to disaster. Thus, God went silent. And when they came to the realization that their actions were wrong, they prayed to God to hear their cries, and God heard them and responded in kind. Think of the example of the prodigal son in the pigsty. The son went back home to his father to ask for forgiveness after he realized that the pigs were eating better than him. And he came to the realization that what he had done had put him in this position and that he should go back home, ask for forgiveness for what he had done, and he would at least be better off than he was then. And even before he got to his father, and even before he got even to blurt out that he was sorry, his father had forgiven him. His father took him in his arms and welcomed him home. And it's the younger son, his realization, that allowed him to accept his father's forgiveness and by extension, redemption. God is silent because there are times when people need to come to an aha moment in their life and help their situation move along. Thus, in times such as the one we are in now in this pandemic, it is imperative for us to have hope that is not based on external events or attitudes. Think, as I said earlier, St. Paul's words, walk by faith, not by sight, but on knowing internally, that is having it etched on our hearts in this covenant with God, that it is strong and unshakable and forms a foundation of how we live daily. The new covenant with God is the core of Jeremiah's message, and in order for God's people to remain firmly planted in their relationship with God, they will need to know from birth to death that this relationship comes with the responsibility of staying rooted in trust and loyalty, doing the things that God asks of them, which is really to walk humbly, justly, and lovingly. It is the same for us today. And as easy as it is to be distracted and stray from our spiritual core, staying focused and connected is our only hope and option for living into the future.